Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping right into GotQuestions.org's incredibly detailed theological breakdown of exactly how the Bible defines manhood. You know, whether you're a longtime theology student or just fascinated by the roots of Western thought, these ancient scriptural frameworks have literally shaped societal structures for millennia. So we're going to impartially unpack the original texts, the structural designs, and the practical roles laid out in Scripture. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be hitting 1. Creation and language. 2. The complementary design. 3. Equality versus identity. 4. Covenants and biblical roles. And finally 5. Fulfilling the calling.
So, Section 1. Creation and language.
Let's start at the absolute foundation, right in the book of Genesis. To really grasp the biblical definition of a man, we've got to look at the specific linguistic roots the ancient writers used. When the text talks about God creating humanity as male and female, it uses the original Hebrew word zakar. Now, the source points out that this root word carries an original meaning of sharpness or prominence, and scholars broadly agree this is a direct reference to male physiological anatomy. Why does this matter? Well, right out of the gate, it anchors the entire biblical concept of manhood straight to physical, biological reality. In this specific framework, identity isn't some abstract feeling, it's literally grounded in physical form right from the dawn of creation.
And that deep physical anchoring brings us to a pretty surprising, maybe even amusing translation later on. In historical books like 1 Samuel and 1 Kings, the writers use this rare, highly literal Old Testament euphemism for man. Translated literally, it means one who urinates on a wall. Now, obviously, idioms were super common in the ancient Near East, but the fact that they used this deeply physical phrase really proves how heavily those ancient writers relied on clear, observable physical functions to categorize manhood. Biology was absolutely front and center.
Fast forward hundreds of years from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and the language shifts completely from Hebrew to Greek. But what's fascinating here is that the biological and relational anchoring stays exactly the same. We see two key Greek words used. First, aner, which denotes a biological male adult, and it's also the exact word used for a husband. Then there's arson, which denotes the male gender itself. So despite this massive shift in culture, era, and language, these Greek definitions continue to firmly ground the biblical concept of manhood in biological reality and relational responsibility.
Moving on to Section 2, the complementary design.
Think about the sheer theological weight of the early creation narrative. Up to this point, you have a flawless God creating a flawless universe, repeatedly calling everything good. But then, the text suddenly hits the brakes. God declares it is not good for the man to be alone. This is literally the first time anything in all of creation gets slapped with a not good. The analysis points out that this introduces a non-negotiable need for relational completion. According to the text, a man on his own is fundamentally incomplete.
So how does the text fix this isolated state? Enter Eve. And she isn't brought in as some secondary accessory or a mere afterthought. She is presented as a deeply necessary complement, a corresponding opposite. God provides exactly what was physically and relationally lacking in Adam. This deliberate pairing is what allows Adam to transition from just being a lone male into part of a legitimate, complete model of humanity. In this ancient worldview, you absolutely need this indispensable procreative match, male and female brought together, to accurately reflect the image of God.
That brings us to Section 3, Equality versus Identity. Now, this complementary design brings us to a highly nuanced and supercritical theological boundary. When examining how men and women relate in these texts, the source makes a massive distinction between equality and identity. The breakdown emphasizes that men and women possess total, unambiguous spiritual equality. They are equally valued, equally loved, and equally saved in God's eyes. Their ultimate spiritual worth is exactly the same. However, and this is key for the biblical framework, spiritual equality absolutely does not mean equal identity or interchangeable function. The text maintains a very firm structural distinction between the sexes.
So why does the text focus so much on drawing boundaries around these physical attributes? Because in this framework, biology basically dictates destiny when it comes to family and societal structure. The foundational realities, things like men generally being larger and stronger, being totally incapable of bearing children, and their distinct biological role in reproduction, well, they aren't treated as mere footnotes. They're the structural realities that define what a man is actually equipped to do. The text uses these innate physical differences to dictate the exact roles a man is uniquely expected to step into.
Section 4, Covenants and Biblical Roles.
So how did these foundational biological differences actually play out in everyday life under ancient biblical covenants? Well,
While the path to spiritual maturity was similar for everyone, the Old Covenant laid a remarkably distinct, heavy burden of responsibility specifically on men. Think about the cultural weight here. Circumcision, the literal physical sign of the covenant, was exclusively for males. Priestly duties with sacred food offerings, restricted solely to Aaron's male descendants. Plus, all men were required to travel and appear before the Lord at 3 major annual feasts. And they weren't just showing up for themselves. They carried the symbolic weight of representing their entire families before God. On top of all that, the firstborn males were completely consecrated as holy to the Lord.
Now, as we shift timelines from the Old Testament into the New Testament church and family structures, the expectations get even more specific. Men are explicitly designed to be spiritual leaders, teachers, and heads of the marriage. But here is where the text gets incredibly revolutionary for its time. In the first century Roman and Greco world, men were basically absolute cultural overlords. They held literal life and death power over their households, yet these scriptures actively warn against tyrannical behavior. Headship is completely redefined. It's not a mandate to dominate, it's a calling to be loving, faithful servants. This was a remarkably countercultural mandate that stripped away societal machismo and replaced it entirely with sacrificial service. But to actually achieve that radical, servant-hearted leadership, a man has to operate strictly within a very demanding character framework. Just being biologically male is definitely not enough to meet the standard here. The mandates insist on men being present, good fathers, and men of unwavering sexual integrity. They have to operate in genuine humility and respect, constantly demonstrating active compassion and godliness. The core argument here is that biology provides the necessary foundation, sure, but without this specific character framework, a man is failing to meet the true biblical standard. Leadership without deep compassion is seen as a total failure of the design.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Fulfilling the Calling.
Theologian Jonathan Parnell summarizes this entire overarching framework so perfectly with this thought. He notes that what makes men men or women women is intrinsically connected to the majesty of God in our design. So what does it actually mean to have your gender definition connected to divine majesty? It means these distinct definitions, physical traits, and roles aren't just arbitrary ancient rules. The ultimate goal is for humans to become the most God-glorifying expressions of His character. Our physical realities and assigned relational roles exist primarily to beautifully display the glory and intentionality of the Creator to the rest of the world.
Ultimately, the practical outworking of all these incredibly dense theological and biological definitions boils down to exactly this: fulfilling the calling. The breakdown suggests that when a man truly embraces this specific framework, when he accepts his physical design, steps into his relational role with total humility, and actively chooses to be a servant leader, he isn't just blindly following archaic rules. By doing so, he successfully honors Christ within his community and glorifies God in the wider world. It is the very practical, everyday application of loving God, serving God, and loving your neighbor, just executed through the specific, intentional lens of biblical manhood.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a crucial question to ponder. We've just traced exactly how these scriptural texts define manhood through the strict lenses of biology, relational complementarianism, and the totally countercultural roles of servant leadership. So, how does understanding these ancient foundational definitions change the way we view modern conversations about gender and faith? When you take a moment to look at the stark contrasts between today's rapidly shifting sociological definitions and these incredibly firm ancient biblical frameworks, it definitely gives us a profound amount to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive into the text, and keep exploring.